welcome to the stage Nick Laird, Zadie Smith and John Mullan.
Thanks very much. I think maybe this is the first event at this festival where the two people on the sofa don't feel weird about it. Thanks very much for coming. I know that Uruguay, Portugal is probably going to be a bit disappointing, actually. But I kind of feel if it was England, Brazil, you'd all still be here. This is a kind of book-loving arrondissement. I know that. And for a book-loving arrondissement, what could be a better event than having Zadie and Nick here? And provokingly, their two most recent books, as if requiring us to have this event, have the same title. Yeah. Feel Free. They're both called Feel Free. Nick's book of poems and Zadie's book of essays. And it's kind of, we have exam questions which they compare and contrast. Right. And I mean, it is a demand to do that. And we thought what we'd do is that each of them will do a short reading to give you a taster at the beginning. And Nick's going to read first, and then I'll ask him a question, just maybe one question provoked by his reading, and then Zadie will read from her book, and I'll ask her something, and then we'll enter into full interlocution. Yeah?
Cool.
Okay. So, Nick.
Hi. I'm delighted to be here right around the corner from my house. And to be Zadie's hype man. I said to Zadie I was going to read this poem, Feel Free, and she said, no, don't read that. That won't work. But I'm going to read it anyway. She told me to read a poem about my mother dying last year, which I felt would have been a kind of downer on this warm day. So this is a poem called Feel Free, and it mentions Harvey, who is our son, and Catherine, who is our daughter. And it's in 3 short-ish parts. It mentions an Argos. This isn't relevant, but the Argos is the one on Cricklewood Broadway, not Kilburn High Road. So feel free. To deal with all the sensational loss, I like to interface with Earth. I like to do this in a number of ways. I like to feel the work I am exerting being changed, the weight of my person refigured, and I like to hang above the ground, thus snorkeling, hammocks, alcohol. I also like the mind to feel a kind of neutral buoyancy, and to that end I set aside a day a week, Shabbat, to not act. Having ceded independence to the sunset, I will not be shaving, illuminating rooms, or raising the temperature of food. If occasionally I like to feel the leavening of being near a much larger unnatural tension, I walk off a Sunday through the high fields of blanket bog, saxifrage, a few thin belted galloways, rounding Loch Malin to stand by the foam of beauty upheld in a scrubby acre at Craigandevsky. What I do duck and enter under a capstone mapped by rival empires of yellow feather moss and powdery white lichen. I like then to stop, crouched, and press my back on a housing of actual rock, coldness which lives for a while on the skin. And I like when I give you the night feed, Harvey, how you're concentrating on it, fists clenched, eyes shut, like this is bliss. 2. I like a steady disruption. I like it when the solid mantle turns to shingle and water rushes up it over and over in love. My white noise machine from Argos is set to crashing wave, but I'm not averse to the presence of numerous and minute quanta moving very fast in unison, occasions when a light wind undulates the ears of wheat, or a Hessian sack of pearl barley seed is sliced with a pocket knife and pause. I like the way it sounds, pattering on stone. I like how the starlings over Monte cohere and separate their bodies into one cyclonic symphony. And I like that the hawk of the mind catches at their pulse, call, arc. I like the excitation passing as a shadow ripple back and how the bag is snatched, rolls slack, straight, falciform, mouthing, bulbing, a pumping heart. I like to interface with millions of coloured pixels depicting attractive people procreating on a screen itself, dependent on rare metals mined by mud-grey children who trudge up bamboo scaffolding above a greyish-red lake of belching mud. I like how the furnace burning earth instills in me reflexive gestures of timidity, self-pity and deference as I walk across the kind of surfaces, grass, say, or sand, unable ever to meet with my eyes the gaze of the sun. 3. I can imagine that my first and fifth marriages will be to the same human, a woman, the first marriage working well enough that we decide to try again as soon as it's, mutually convenient. I can see that. I like the fact we're supercooled star matter, even if I can't envisage you as anything other than warm and bleeding. The thing is, I can be persuaded fairly easily to initiate immune responses by the fake safety signals of national anthems, cleavage, family photographs, country lanes, large-eyed mammals, fireworks, the King James Bible, Nina Simone singing the 12th of Never, cave paintings, coffins, dolphins, dolmens. But I like it also when the fat impasto of the canvas gets slashed by a tourist with a claw hammer and a glimpse is caught of what you couldn't say. Entanglement I like, spooky action at a distance, analogizing some little thing, including this long glance across the escalators, or how you know the song before you switch the station on. When a photon of light meets a half-silvered mirror and splits, one meets the superposition of two, being twinned, and this repeats. Tickling your back, Catherine, to get you to sleep. I like to lie here with my eyes closed and think about my school friends' houses before choosing one to walk through slowly, room by sunlit room.
I think a Northern Ireland accent's an advantage, isn't it? If you're going to be a poet. Can I ask you? That's the title poem of the collection.
Yeah.
Can I ask you why you called it "Feel Free"?
The poem or the book?
This poem, yeah.
The poem.
That everyone.
I suppose it's about finding ways to feel free within constraints, which is also about what poetry itself is about, kind of coming through constraints into a kind of sweetening or felicity. And so it sort of seemed, the whole book, in a way I was writing into that title, was sort of about different forms of freedom and constraint, and how I think when you get to our age and we're 42, like you feel very crushed by your children and also by your dying parents, and it can be a difficult enough time of life. So, the middle, what did McNeice say? The middle stretch is difficult for poets. So trying to find ways of encountering that.
And I was just thinking when I was hearing you read it, when we were all hearing you read it, I had it in front of me as well, and like there's quite a lot of the poems in this collection, not all, but quite a few, have a pattern on the eye, which is, you can hear sometimes when you read it out, but sometimes you can't. And there's one pattern which you use more than any other, I think, which is the pattern of this poem, which is the 3-line stanzas.
Right. Yeah.
So is that part of the same kind of attempt to get freedom and constraint together on the same page?
Yeah, I think in terms of form, certainly I'm always trying to move around in different forms, but in this book it seemed this long 3-line tercet. A lot of the stuff was sort of held together by it, and I do believe that a form is kind of useful for a poet. It kind of extends the thought in interesting ways. If you find a form, then the rest of it kind of follows. So Yeats talked about all that is personal soon rots, it must be packed in ice or salt, and the form is also like that for me. So.
Can we? There's some other things about the poem I want to ask about, but maybe I can leave it till later. And yes, you think she's getting bored, do you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I feel the aura.
Yeah. Okay. So should we go over to the other side of the sofa for a bit? Yes. Okay. Zadie, what are you going to read?
I'm going to read from a book called Feel Free. I feel the need to explain it. Basically what happened is that Nick wrote that poem, which was in the New Yorker, I think, a long time ago. And I read it, obviously. And then I just liked the title, and so I nixed it. That's what happened. And it actually happened before with On Beauty as well, which I believe was also a poem, and I nicked that.
Yes, becoming a part.
So I nicked it, and then I thought that we'd come to some kind of accommodation. But in the end, we just kept the title. Both of us kept the title. But what I like about it is...
just so my recollection is different.
Okay, that seems fair. But what I like about it is that in the end, the books are in completely different form, like what Nick just said about packing something in ice and salt. Obviously, prose is different from poetic form, but I think a lot of the ideas are the same in the end. I mean, that's probably inevitable because we live in the same house. But I noticed that that there's a similarity, an idea of how to feel free within constrictions. Yeah. So I'm just going to read 2 pages of an essay called Joy. It might be useful to distinguish between pleasure and joy. But maybe everybody does this very easily all the time, and only I am confused. A lot of people seem to feel that joy is only the most intense version of pleasure, arrived at by the same road. You simply have to go a little further down the track. That has not been my experience. And if you ask me if I wanted more joyful experiences in my life, I wouldn't be at all sure I did. Exactly because it proves such a difficult emotion to manage. It's not at all obvious to me how we should make an accommodation between joy and the rest of our everyday lives. Perhaps the first thing to say is that I experience at least a little pleasure every day. I wonder if this is more than the usual amount. It was the same even in childhood when most people are miserable. I don't think this is because so many wonderful things happen to me, but rather that the small things go a long way. I seem to get more than the ordinary satisfaction out of food, for example, any old food. An egg sandwich from one of these grimy food vans on Washington Square has a genuine power to turn my day around. Whatever is put in front of me food-wise will usually get a 5-star review. You'd think that people would like to cook for or eat with me. In fact, I'm told it's boring. Where there is no discernment, there can be no awareness of expertise or gratitude for special effort. Don't say that was delicious, my husband warns. You say everything's delicious. But it was delicious. It drives him crazy. All day long I can look forward to a popsicle. The persistent anxiety that fills the rest of my life is calm for as long as I have the flavour of something good in my mouth. And though it's true that when the flavour is finished, the anxiety returns, we don't have so many reliable sources of pleasure in this life as to turn our nose up at one that's so readily available, especially here in America. A pineapple popsicle. Even the great anxiety of writing can be stilled for the 8 minutes it takes to eat a pineapple popsicle. My other source of daily pleasure is, but I wish I had a better way of putting it, other people's faces. A red-headed girl with a marvellous large nose that she probably hates, and green eyes, and that sun-shy complexion composed more of freckles than skin. Or a heavy-set grown man smoking a cigarette in the rain, with a soggy moustache, combined with a surprise, the keen eyes, snub nose, and cherub mouth of his own 8-year-old self. Upon leaving the library at the end of the day, I will walk a little more quickly to the apartment to tell my husband about an angular, cat-eyed teenager in skinny jeans and stacked-heeled boots, a perfectly ordinary grey sweatshirt, last night's makeup, and a silky Pocahontas wig slightly askew over his afro. He was sashaying down the streets, plaits flying, using the whole of Broadway as his personal catwalk. Miss Dang, but off-duty. I add this for clarity, but my husband nods a little impatiently. There was no need for the addition. My husband is also a professional gawker. That's it.
So that bit of the essay is about your pleasure in things, but kind of the essay's about something a bit different, isn't it? It's about a more painful and pulsating and rarer thing.
Joy. I was kind of interested in the idea that a lot of things that we choose in life are hard to choose because they're not in the same measure as consumer goods or lifestyle choices. And that in the obvious case they don't bring you an immediate amount of pleasure. Obviously, children are the primary example. Like, if you're offered that deal, how would you like not to sleep for 5 years? How would you like to spend loads of money you don't have, et cetera, et cetera? It all looks terrible. And I was just interested in the idea that elemental things in our lives have been kind of shifted into a basket called lifestyle, and once you put it there, everything looks really unreasonable. But if you accept it as this kind of extremity, which a joy is a good word for it, then it makes a bit more sense.
And in this essay, I guess whenever I go from reading one of your novels to reading your essays, the thing about your essays is even when they kind of started off sometimes as reviews. I mean, when I write a review, which I hack out sometimes, it's a very sort of austere thing.
Right.
Boom, boom, boom. And if I occasionally put the word I in, I would,
Right.
I would then kind of walk around the block a few times and
Right.
talk myself out of it, really.
But that's absolutely the difference between England and America. I mean,
yeah.
you found this too, no? That in American journals, this I is allowed. And when I first got to America, I thought it was completely outrageous, in principle. But look how I've got into it.
But isn't it? But it's all, isn't that a liberation though? Because your novels, I know the most recent one was a first-person
Right.
novel, but novels seem so much about removing yourself
Right.
or at least giving the book over to others. And is it that writing essays, including reviews, if they start that way, is a sort of is a kind of liberation after that exercise?
It's stylized. Like, obviously, I have Nick in the next room, and poetry, we sometimes have this argument, but it's always about I. Poems are full of I everywhere. Yeah. This kind of song of self. And I spent a long time writing in a very distant third person. But I guess even the I of the essays is not, it's stylized. It's not really intimate. I don't think I write very intimately, particularly.
I think sometimes the readers, though, think that it is a special kind of, it's a special gift and a special pleasure to read your essays because they may not think they're getting your deepest self, but they are being taken into your confidence. I mean,
right.
And you even do that stylistically. You sort of say, yeah, you can go off and have a look at that now if you want and come back later. I'll wait.
Right, yeah. I just, when we were in college, I really loved my degree, but I felt often in an English class there was no space to express something that readers feel instinctively, which is, affection, love, desire. All these things were kind of not to be spoken of. So I felt when I wrote my essays I wanted to include them. Maybe that's a sort of one of the probably many baleful effects of academic training. Once upon a time, essays were things that, I don't know, Hazlitt or Virginia Woolf wrote, which were full of them. If one of my students sticks I in an essay, well, I don't think they ever do. They wouldn't dare. No, mine neither, No. I think that's really good training, but to mention Hazlitt and Woolf, those to me are ideal, They're at the height of the essay.
And Nick, the poem you read, as you explained before you read it, has got one of your children in it, and your kids crop up in some of your essays, Zadie, as well, and you joke about it. The yoke of parenthood, but they seem quite a kinetic principle in both of your writings.
You take that one.
Yeah.
Well, they're always there.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's
just
the thing.
Every time I open the door, they're behind it. They're really so, and they're really noisy. So, yeah.
But once upon a time, that was...
Yeah, they're always there.
Once upon a time, that was weird. I remember there was some interview, it was a printed interview, I think, where somebody was saying to Sylvia Plath, you've put your baby in your poem.
Yeah.
Right.
And she said, well, that's what I spent a lot of time doing or something.
Right.
But I think that's...
Well, I don't think Tennyson was changing nappies, no. I mean, I think it was but that's different, no.
You were saying that you were writing about Dickens, and he's a good example of someone with a huge amount of children, and then these kind of idealized children in the books.
Like
But
you
then-
never met a real child.
Like you'd never met a real child. It's really fascinating, despite having 10 of them in the house.
Yeah.
And then these toxic relationships in real life with his actual
Yes.
children.
Yeah.
Well, he
So-
certainly met them in real. I mean, he,
He
didn't
met them,
Yes.
but maybe not wholly. Yeah.
A short period of time every day. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're right, Zadie, about I. I asked you about I in your essays. I mean, most of your poems have got I in this collection. It was a bit of a shock to everybody in the tent when you read that poem about how you're planning to get married 5 times, because
Yeah.
we kind of.
What's that about?
I'm still young. I mean, well, the I in the poem is not the I, obviously, but. Well, I think
Sometimes it is, isn't
Sometimes
it?
it is,
Sometimes it
and
is.
actually, it's much more complicated than just saying it's the speaker of the poem. But I think the way I think about poetry is as a kind of. I think of it like if you go, like we talk about diving in that poem, like scuba diving, and you have to equalize the pressure in some ways. And I do think of poetry. This is Wallace Stevens' line about the violence from within to counter the violence without. So this idea of an interior life coming up to meet exterior life, and I think of poetry as a kind of way of equalizing the pressure. So some of the stuff that comes out in the poem is a way of kind of countering external reality in some degree, and some of the way that you do that is by exploring the different kinds of I that exist within you, I think. So.
Right.
And the poem that Zadie told you to read, but you didn't read, and some of the other poems in the collection are clearly very personal, and you
Sure.
yeah, and they're about your mother's death, and they're about your relationship with your father,
Yeah.
and
Well, I mean, I do like, and I've felt that more and more of poetry as a kind of. So the poem in there that's really about going to see my mother. I was flying over. There's a poem called "The Vehicle and the Tenor," which is the 2 parts of a metaphor. But I had a weird experience after I'd written that poem, and it never really has happened, that I've gone back to that poem again and again and read it when I felt in despair or grief or whatever, and it was a kind of. I suddenly sort of realised that what the poems have been doing for me for 30 years is forms of kind of dealing with things. I know that sounds ludicrous to say
It's
at the
so
age of
crazy that
42.
it's taken us
I
like
know.
50 years to notice that writing is therapeutic.
I know. And if people said that to me 5 years ago,
Yeah, I
I'd
know,
be like,
wouldn't have
stop
had it.
saying
Yeah,
writing
yeah,
is
I
therapy.
wouldn't have
I
had
don't
it.
think writing is therapy, but to see that, like, in a way, to kind of master the emotion, or at least meet the emotion head on, or find ways of containing it or memorializing it, or whatever the thing is, putting it down in words,
Right.
is definitely a kind of form of dealing with the thing. So it became more naked and obvious to me, certainly in this book, than in prior books, which seemed more exploratory. This was definitely consolatory,
Yeah.
I'd say.
is it sort of just a kind of nel mezzo del camino nostra vita sort of
Yeah.
thing?
For sure.
Because
Which they coming up in the book as well, in the midst of my,
I see that coming up in all the books of our peers. Like Nicole Krauss's novel is called
Yeah.
Dark Forest. Like
Yeah.
you could find in all these books written by people of our age in the same year, the same metaphors.
So
the
John's
same middle
quoting
life,
the first line of Dante's Inferno.
the same dark forest.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think about that thing that Larkin said about he would make a poem like a machine to replicate a certain emotion. Why he loved love lyrics, and so whenever you read this poem, that particular way of being in the world, that particular emotion was memorialized and kept. But in his case, it's also about, and I recognize this in myself, emotional avoidance. So instead of feeling joy, or you can just write an essay about it, so it's just kind of contained in the essay as a separate issue. And I think that is a big part of writing, a kind of control freakery.
But
Other
so-
people just feel things and are satisfied with that.
Right. But Freud would talk about it as a kind of repetitive behavior, like that you go back to the site in some way
Yes.
in order to
If you're
feel this
rereading it, that's
pain
what you're
again.
doing, yeah.
And there's one of my favourite essays in the collection, Zadie, is the one about your bathroom.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
a kind of that's because several of the essays in your piece are kind of go back quite a lot in time, and are sort of bits have shards of memoir in, I guess. And one of the ones which is most memorable is this one, which is about the bathroom, what the bathroom's like, and that's a kind of way of. If you wrote poetry, you'd definitely have written a poem called The Bathroom, wouldn't you?
This is it. And that's what I've always kind of been jealous of in poetry. I think a lot of prose writers are, that it can encapsulate and imprison something that way. For me, the essay is the closest to that. Novels are much messier. You're never the containment is never complete, and you're not in total control. A novel is a very long stretch to try and write something good, to put it simply. Whoever said that thing about a novel is a long piece of prose with something wrong with it. Right? An essay is a kind of more hopeful and contained thing. And I do notice that poets read their own poetry with pleasure, which I think is very unusual for novelists to sit down and saying, ooh, time to reread London Fields.
There are one or two.
I don't read them.
I did a thing. Howard Jacobson was reading it, and clearly he would have been there all day reading
Really?
it. Oh, you'd have
God.
loved it.
No, that's not my experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Edna O'Brien. So
Yes.
she doesn't even need to read it. She just
Memorise
does it.
it.
Yeah. But you say that about the novel, but one thing that comes up lots of times in the essays is a kind of not sustained. It sort of flickers into the light and then back again about novels. I mean, one of the things you get from reading the essays is that, or you say somewhere, my sole area of expertise, reading novels.
Right.
But you write them as well,
Yes.
and the idea that the novel is a place to kind of, to feel free, maybe as a reader as much as a writer, to escape the assumptions you usually have, the loyalties you usually profess.
Yes, that, but also maybe escape full stop. I was talking to Nick about that Francis Bufford book. I love Francis Bufford, great British writer. No, not actually that one, the boy that books built.
Yeah.
And he has this little introduction where he says, the weird thing about reading, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room have the same feeling, is that basically it is an addiction. People who read the way we read, and I'm sure a lot of people here read when you can't go to shops without 8 books in your bag and all that nonsense. But it's one of the few addictions which is socially acceptable. So what Bufford was pointing out, in his case, his sister died when he was very young, so there's huge trauma in the house. But the fact that he wanted to sit and read a book all day, nobody had a problem with it, And his question is, well, is there something problematic about it, about these children who want to do nothing but read and to always have something between them and the world, a book? You're used to the critique in terms of screens, but books are also a kind of screen. I grew up in that way.
I did too, but don't you, I mean, that's I sometimes feel I felt it a bit when in the essay in this volume about Facebook, when I found myself going, absolutely agree with that, and oh dear, because when I was a teenager, novels were all there were. You grew up in Wiltshire, there's absolutely zero. And then now I spend my time reading UCAS forms, and they've all kind of gone to Ecuador or, Duke of Edinburgh. I mean, I don't know. And they've all got the diddle as well.
Diddle.
What's he talking about?
I think he's talking about technology. Technology.
Okay.
I'm suggesting, Nick, that kind of an early love of fiction is born out of a kind of sort of boredom
and trauma, two things together. But I think with the screen, his idea of the novel as a kind of screen, the difference I would make between that and the kind of contemporary screens we're dealing with is just maybe like a qualitative thing,
Yeah.
And I don't deny that novel is a kind of act of emotional avoidance, also a thing to put between you and the world. But when we're talking about our mutual friend back there, the quality of that screen or of that illusion, it has so much depth and so much, you can gather so much meaning from it, that for me it is an excusable sin, But it's certainly the case if reading was this enormously improving thing, writers would be angels and, social ideal. And it's not the case, right? They have all the normal
They do, although some
vanities.
readers want their novelists to be kind of better people than normal people.
Right, yeah.
Or exemplary, or I thought you're having to sign morality clauses now. That
hasn't happened to me yet. I don't think I'd pass one. No.
And Nick, is it too crude to say that because I wanted to talk a bit about your most recent novel as well, Modern Gods. Is it too crude to say that when quite a lot of the time when you're writing poetry, it's you, and when you're writing fiction, it's all given over to characters?
It's maybe a wee bit of a simplification. Like, there's quite a lot of my sort of life in Modern Gods, the sort of Northern Irish half.
Yes.
Not the Papua New Guinean half. But
have you been to New Guinea? Because about a third of the novel is set in an island called New Ulster, which is sort of off the coast of New Guinea, basically.
Yeah, so there is a New Ireland and a New Britain, but there isn't a New Ulster
Yeah.
in real life. I haven't been to Papua New Guinea. I've been to Fiji, which I felt was like close enough in some ways. And you can do a lot of stuff on YouTube now. All the diddly-diddle.
Yeah.
So, and in a way, like I wanted it to be, it's meant to be a kind of contrived flip of Ulster and then this new Ulster. So it's kind of meant to be like almost a fever dream or whatever. So I wasn't too concerned about it being exactly right. Yeah.
And Ulster's in the poems as well. If only for the best kind of place names in the lexicon, you must think, at least I've got those in my quiver.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think that, but yeah. I mean, these are just places that you know that are around me, but yeah, they do sound good. You can't really outrun your home, and I've just made that a documentary of Brian Hill, like a poem film thing about the Troubles, and I've just like written that. Hopefully, that last piece of fiction about it, and hopefully, the last poems about it, because I'm you kind of want to like not keep returning to it, but it's a kind of original wound that you end up going back to. So, and because I spent a lot of time in Ulster, and because Ulster refuses to kind of move forwards in lots of ways, it's impossible not to write about it. I mean, lyric poets, I think in general, go back to childhood. That's sort of all there is, almost.
But I think writers in general.
Yeah.
And one definition of a writer might be someone who's unnaturally preoccupied with the first 15 years of their life.
Right.
That seems to me defining.
Everything springs from it. Yeah.
Right.
And in fact, the very plot of Modern Gods, or at least the first half of it, is about, enacts that, isn't it? It's about one of the main characters going back, and there she is. She's in New York. You might have thought
She was free.
she was free,
Yeah.
but she's dragged back.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a kind of Irish. I mean, that is quite a common Irish narrative sort of trope, don't you think?
Well, I mean, there are only so many stories, and one is a stranger arrives in the town, and the other one is you go on a journey. So you always end up. That's a kind of a conflation of both of them.
The Irish do have a habit of leaving and then writing obsessively about where they've left.
Well, Joyce said the quickest way to Tara, which is the ancient name for Ireland, the quickest way to Tara is via Holyhead.
Right.
To get to the heart of Ireland, you have to leave it. And it is certainly true that you get perspectives on a place when you're far away from it. You have to get out of kind of the radio frequency in order to hear it properly.
But the novels, actually, I mean, it doesn't tackle. It tackles the violent recent history of Northern Ireland really right full on. I mean, it's not glancing, is it? It's
no. So it comes from an actual. I had a cup of tea with my friend Colin a few years ago, and Colin said he'd been working with a guy for 2 years, and then this guy got married, and then the next day on the cover of the Sunday Life, which is the sort of Northern Irish paper, it turned out this guy was a sort of mass killer, had been involved in one of the most famous kind of terrorist incidents in Northern Ireland.
And the wife didn't know, right?
No, I think the wife did know.
Oh, okay.
That's fiction in the book. But
she tries it. Well, she could have known, couldn't she? She says she doesn't want to know.
But in real life, the woman, I think, did know. But Colin didn't know. And a lot of the people who knew this guy and had worked with him for years had no idea. And the guy had killed 6 people, 4 Catholics and 2 Protestants, in the Greystale killings, which is the time in 1993 when the guy, 2 guys went into a pub in Greystale in Derry and shouted trick or treat. It was just before Halloween, the night before Halloween, and they were wearing Halloween masks, and then they just shot all these people. And so the guy only ended up serving like 2 years and was let out under the early release scheme. So I wanted to think like what Northern Ireland has had to swallow since the Good Friday Agreement is sort of astonishing. Like I know lots of people who have had to live next door, not actually next door, but like a field away or whatever from someone who's killed their husband and has ended up serving a year in prison, or even my local MP, Francie Malloy of Sinn Féin, is the guy who stood against him in the election. Francie Malloy was the prime suspect in his father's murder. And so the whole thing is really, I think it's very difficult to kind of explain in brief, especially to someone, who's been sort of born and raised in England, perhaps. So I wanted to sort of think about it. Also, the idea of identity politics, we did that already. Right. I grew up in Northern Ireland, and I waited for 20 years for Northern Ireland to become more like the rest of the world, and then what happens is the rest of the world becomes more like Northern Ireland. It's unbelievable. So I wanted to think about that a bit.
You recognise that, do you, Zadie?
Yeah, I mean, I Northern Ireland I know only through Nick, but having gone a lot recently, I just think the thing which fascinates me about in the poems too, but also in the novel, is the idea of a civilized sheen underneath which there's this roiling drama, interpersonal, historical, and not too far under the surface too. Yeah. That always strikes me as extraordinary, and it's like a kind of live civil war at all times. And I'd never really been anywhere like that, I think, until I met Nick. Yeah.
And it's produced quite a lot of good poetry. I know that's a terrible thought, but it has. Yeah. It has produced a lot of good poetry, a lot of electric poetry. Are you aware of that when you write in this collection about Northern Ireland?
Am I aware of other poetry?
Yeah, of other. Yeah,
of course. I mean, Seamus was, not just a friend of mine, but also, the sort of first poet that I'd really read and engaged with, Seamus Heaney, and. I think good poetry tends to produce good poetry. Whenever I was a lawyer, I moved to Warsaw for a year, and one of the reasons was because of Polish poetry. And these small countries like Poland, say, and Northern Ireland, they seem to keep producing the stuff. So I think the work tends to produce good work. It's in dialogue with, and even on the very obvious basic level of saying, this thing, poetry, is a worthwhile way to spend your life. It's something to engage with. It's not ludicrous and I think there are
slightly embarrassing, as the English consider it.
It's slightly embarrassing. Yeah. I mean, it's,
Do you think that's true?
Well, I think compared to Poland, like we've been in Poland and seen 5,000 people in the streets to listen to Szymborska,
Yeah.
It's just extraordinary, like this public form that means so much to so many people. And that is different in England.
I think the culture has a very schizophrenic relationship to poetry, actually, because on one side, I think it is valued, but on another side, it's not on the financial scale of value, obviously, at all. Like, it doesn't sell any copies, and people don't really like it or understand it, and they're kind of scared and a bit annoyed by it. They're kind of like, it makes them a bit cross, but at the same point, they want it to be there. They just don't want to have to engage with it. And
when you die, when you get married, then it appears,
in the kind of intimate cruxes of people's lives, they do turn to it. Yeah.
It gets on. I mean, I'm always surprised that when a poet I thought nobody much had heard of dies, and there they are in the news or something. I mean, fleetingly, perhaps, but still, I don't know.
We have a grand tradition here, but I don't know. I always felt a kind of, because it's so elemental poetry and so direct, that there's something in the English spirit shies away a little bit.
What were we
from
watching
that.
the other day? And the guy was saying, "Oh, my son's a poet," like with kind of shame. And then
not your father.
Laughing. That wasn't my father. No.
But isn't it the
would not do that.
Isn't it the shying away that makes the poetry, though, a bit? I mean, this is not necessarily about your poetry, but that a kind of that's in some really interesting and good poets, it's the reticence or awkwardness that gives it the voltage.
Right, and it's also just in a culture where every language is so direct at the moment. Almost everything is modelled on the spoken word, as in the direct monologic instruction back and forth. That makes all literary writing seem bizarre, antique and strange and indirect and unnecessary. That's for everybody, but I guess poetry is the intensification of that.
The idea that what you want to say is ambiguous, or
that's out of fashion for sure.
Right. So the idea that this thing is complicated, that in itself is out of fashion. But the kind of contraction or compression of language, and at the same point, this kind of expansion of meaning, a kind of ramification of meaning, hard in the age of Twitter or whatever the thing is. Yeah.
But one of the things you obviously both like in your writing is very pronounced in your poems, Nick. It's in the title and in some of your previous titles too, is taking these bits of language, idioms, sometimes cliches that we all use, and sort of, letting them detonate or something. That feel free. We were talking about. You both talked about why you use that that for your 2 titles and about freedom and constraint, because I think of that idiom and I think of somebody asking permission to do something.
Right.
You know, they say, "Oh, can I have an olive?" You know, feel free. And so, and of course, it's a paradoxical.
Right.
It's one of those.
I think that's definitely part of the job of a writer, is to make you to revivify dead language and to make you examine language closely, which is you know. It's the easiest way of doing it, I think, is to play on the cliche.
The job gets harder as the dead language expands. Like now, most of us are spending our daily lives in dead language day and night. Tabloid language, TV language, advertorial language. Just before we were coming here, I was reading this last volume of Karl Ove Knausgaard's book, Struggle, and he has this beautiful description of part of what poetry does, is that when you look at the world, language separates everything into form. So you know you're in a tent, and here are chairs, and there are people, and there's a sofa, and there's some writers sitting up here. But without language, without the separation of concepts, that's not what's here at all. There's colour, light, shape, form.
Right.
It's completely wild. The world is wild, and part of your job of language is controlling it, so you can say, the table's not a part of the woman, the cup is separate, the water is something else. That's one way of conceiving of reality, but it's not the truth. It's just the practical truth. So one of the things that poetry can do is dismantle the language you use every day just to function in the world and try and see again. And for me, that long poem, Feel Free, is about that, like looking at things as if the language wasn't ready-made for you at all times.
And what about novels? Because one of the things your collection did is I bought a book, which I very rarely do. I don't like buying books. I like scrounging them.
Yes, that's part of our business.
And I managed to do that very successfully. You saw me in operation, didn't you? And was it a bit rude? But it was smooth. It was good.
It was good.
Right.
Yeah,
I got it. But I did actually buy a book I haven't read yet by Peter Stamm.
Oh yeah, it's a great book.
Which one?
And is it called 7 Years?
Yeah, wonderful.
And I bought it because actually you were writing about it and it sounded fascinating. But also you were writing about it in a way which I think is characteristic of the collection of essays as something that it seemed to sort of sidestep all the proper kind of expectations of this character, what this character should be like, how this character should behave. And I think you said somewhere at the end that, you know, it's a novel to make you doubt your own dogma or something.
I love that novel. I mean,
it's great.
One of the things Knausgaard was saying, I don't disagree with them, is that novels are part of the social false world. You know, they're wonderful and they're lovely, but thinking about someone like Dickens, the only world he's dealing with is the one that exists between people. There's nothing elemental in Dickens. There's no real death, or there's no eternity, there's no real sense of God. Or it's about how we relate to each other in our social lives, how funny it is, how absurd it is, how tragic it is, blah, blah, blah. So I love novels for that, because they're fun, and they make you think and they make you organise your social world. But every now and then, a novel like Peter Stamm's, to me, does a bit more, you know, does a bit more than say, oh, this is how people are these days, or this is the way our country is at the moment. Does something much more, existential, that you're reading, you feel like you're reading about existence, not just about, you know, life in London or whatever it is. Yeah. Life in London is my area, of course. I don't complain about, but that is my area, yeah.
Well, life in London, it's time this is life in London, so we should give everybody here, or some of the people here, a chance to ask Nick and Zadie things. I think have we got some mics? Well, there's a lady there who's just brilliant at you know, she's the one who gets the drink. You've got a 5-minute interval in the play, and she's the one who gets the drink.
Clemency, you had a baby.
Yes,
congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for coming back. It's really hard to think of the word free without thinking about freedom, without thinking about what's going on, both here, but also, of course, in America, where you now live, I think most of the time, if I'm not mistaken. I just wondered, given that poetry and novels can be such the supreme ways of escaping the horrors of life and living, whether there's also a sort of responsibility to address what is going on around you. And I just wondered whether you guys, given that you have both written so eloquently about actual life as it is being lived, and Brexit and how that affects Northern Ireland, everything else, how you sort of feel the role of poetry and fiction, where they are at the moment in this crazy world in which we're living through.
Wither the arts. Laird. Yeah, it's yours.
No, why did you do that? So I feel quite... I think you have to engage with things, but I also feel like the act of writing in itself is... The detail is a political intervention. So whenever you complicate the received narrative that you get when you turn on the television by saying that this is what it is actually like for one person in a place, that in itself makes everything sort of infinitely more complicated, and in itself suggests that these sort of blank platitudes are not acceptable. So I think the art itself has worth, if that's what we're saying, and I think you have to engage. Your turn.
I think poetry makes nothing happen, including prose in that definition. But I have a kind of wistful thinking that people who do make things happen, activists, politicians, serious young people, you can have some effect on their minds. So it's a secondary, it's a very kind of Hail Mary pass. But I guess I'm imagining when I'm teaching that the people I'm teaching might go on to be more useful than me. But I might be able to do something with their minds at a fairly early stage. That's how I think. I know that I don't have an activist mentality, and so my bit is my bit, but it's quite a small bit.
Okay, I've got a quiver full of questions, but I don't want to impose them on you. Yes, there's a gentleman there. Can we wait for the mic to come to you, sir? Yeah.
Can I ask, Zadie, do you consider yourself still to be North West London or American?
Well, I'm still obviously...
I don't really want to put you on the spot.
No, I don't mind. I consider myself British and black British, and I guess a New Yorker as well. Yeah, I would restrict it to the Manhattan neighbourhood.
I had this session with a lady on Kensal Rise West who said you were always Northwest and you couldn't be American.
I'll never be American. I'll never be American. I mean, we have an American child, which is weird. But no, I'm Northwest.
It was just a thought, so thank you.
Yes. Can you wait? Thanks.
Hi, you've mentioned your children a lot as literary superstars. Are you conscious not to sort of put pressure on your kids to sort of end up like you, or are you throwing with them? And just curious as a parent, because I know reading is important for children. So.
My mum's in the audience, so I'm cautious of what I say here. But I would say, well, I guess from general opinion, I don't consider having writer children like a great boon. Maybe my mum feels differently, but I think I have no aspirations for them in that area. It doesn't even cross my mind, because I connect writing with unhappiness. So I don't really want my children to be unhappy. I'd rather they were ordinarily.
I'd like my daughter to be a doctor, to be honest.
Yeah.
So one
normal
of the things,
bougie expectations.
Yeah. So when we were choosing her name, Catherine, I was like, that's a really good doctor's name.
Solid. Doctor's name.
Whatever the thing is.
Yeah. I mean, my mum has a writer, a stand-up comedian, actor, and a rapper. I don't know. What's that like? All right? Is that all right? Yeah, she thinks it's good. She's up for it. But yeah, I don't. I think of creativity as, it's nice and everything, but it's also just nice to be just happy.
We're trying to get the 8-year-old to read more books, and she's sort of quite resistant. She likes graphic novels.
They have no natural interest in the whole realm.
But also, as a parent of teenagers, the notion that you could actually manage to influence. There's a brilliant comic novel called Tristram Shandy about a father who thinks he can form his son's identity, and
it's a nonsense.
It's like yes, it's not a possible project. Where have we got to? Yes.
Hiya. Does that work? Yep. I was wondering what you've done in terms of digital kind of writing, and things have changed a lot in the last 20 years, and what opportunities and ways to communicate with people do you see in the digital form as opposed to just the paper form?
I would say we've been fundamentally left behind by the religion. Yeah. We have no.
We've rejected all of it.
We have no.
Do you know? We did do Facebook for a month or two, did we? Like 6 or 7 years ago.
It's more like 10 years ago, my friend. Yeah.
I write on a computer. That's kind of digital. I don't know. Like I don't. I think it's kind of antithetical to the. I think I need to be in a quiet space to read a poem, and I find I don't have a smartphone. We've never had smartphones, either of us. But even if my laptop is near me when I'm trying to read, like 20% of my cognitive capacity is gone. I have to put it away in another room, and what I do all the time is I have Freedom on my computer. That program. It clicks on at 10 o'clock, it stays on till 1, it clicks on at 2, it stays on till 5, and then it's from 6 to 10.
What is this? I don't know what
like
this
keeps me offline.
Oh, it's okay.
But that doesn't
it's
mean
the
that
sort of Jonathan Franzen.
Right, but Jonathan,
but don't say that.
Sorry. Okay.
We're all older, and there might be
yeah.
young cyborgs for whom it is a natural thing, and that's all cool. It's just I am not one of those cyborgs.
I find it incredibly distracting, and
Yeah.
I do think writers are kind of addictive beasts.
Yeah.
Right.
And if I know that we will just, if we are online, like an hour will go past, we've done nothing
Hours.
at all.
But the point is, it's a gain and a loss. Like, I'm totally aware of all the things I lose, not understanding the present moment, not being in touch with the kids, etc., etc., etc. But the thing that I gain, which I want, is freedom inside my head to think uninterrupted. So for me, it's worth the exchange. I absolutely get it for other people. It's not worth the exchange. They want to know what's happening today, and they want to be right on top of it. But I honestly find I don't even though we're not on Instagram, we don't know what's happening in the minute. I get the picture. Like, I get the general sense most of the time.
Yeah.
You know, it's not that hard to figure out
We get a
what's going
newspaper
on.
delivered every day.
Yeah, I get the sense.
We read the newspaper.
But no, you know, and if there's a rolling Kanye story, I don't know every beat of it. But by the evening, I know. And so I've not wasted 9 hours. I've only wasted 20 minutes at the end of the day by getting the summary of what occurred in the previous 9 hours.
But
I find that works.
But there is to contend. I mean, there is for the reader of some of your poems, not most of them, but some of them. There's a poem I enjoy very much called Crunch. Okay, and I say you say poem. It's a kind of dialogue, and it's full of some quite abstruse, but obviously kind of proper noun type references.
Right.
So it refers to something, and it would have been quite an exasperating poem to read if it hadn't been for Google. I mean, pre-Google, I would have had to do what people used to have to do with sort of Ezra Pound's cantos. They had to spend a lot of time looking up stuff, or they had to get a book by somebody else who'd spent that time. But actually, it's really good fun reading this kind of poem now, because you can quickly find out what happened at Tunguska.
Right.
So maybe writers kind of depend on things.
It. But it's both things. Like, we are writing with the assumption that the reader is a cyborg. Absolutely. Like, when I'm writing Springtime, you know they're going to watch every video, and that's the point. But I don't want to be a cyborg, because it's selfish on my part.
But also, John, to say that you're using the internet as an encyclopedia is one thing, but that's not what people are using. That's not what we're talking about. Like, if that was just the only thing the internet was, it would be an incredible research thing, but it's not that. It's a time suck and a distraction, and it sort of reduces all interest in a complicated argument into these two things banging against each other. And like, the encyclopedic aspects of it are obviously brilliant and useful for poetry, but it's the other stuff. It's the screaming and the self-promotion, and I can't have it at all.
Can't have it at all. The Internet by Nick Laird.
There's a question near the back, and then, yes, if you keep your hand up, you see, then I saw
Zadie read when you published White Teeth.
Oh, yeah.
Very young. Somewhere weird like the Bulgarian embassy.
Yeah, I have no memory of that, but yeah, go on.
And it was, I just wondered if, that was at the very beginning of what's been an extraordinary trajectory. Just the way you think about writing and how you want to write and how you want to say things, how much do you think it's changed?
I mean, if you ask anyone what's changed between 23 and 42, everything. I don't recognise that person or that novel or that way of thinking. I just think that's the way it goes. But I don't think I'm unusual in that. It's such a long period of time. So everything, everything about the sentences, everything about the conception of what a novel is, changes all the time. But Nick always says I'm too easily influenced. Is that fair to say? Like a leaf in the wind of trend.
Let's not have this argument.
But I do consider that a virtue for the most part. I like to read things and be changed by them.
You're an enthusiast.
I am an enthusiast.
Yeah.
And so change is a kind of inevitable part of that, because you're always reading new things and coming across new ideas, new approaches.
You are actually one of the sort of pleasures of the collection is I don't know if you write bad reviews or...
No, not
but
really.
I don't think you...
My bad reviews, we just do them verbally to each other. A book comes in, we slag it off all day, all night. But then I feel that's fine, I'm good. I don't need to destroy somebody's day. So I don't... Yeah, bad reviews is not something I do.
Yeah.
Zadie, you've written both essays and novels during your career, kind of throughout your career, kind of flitting between the two. And also I've heard you speak about how you find the form of the essay in some ways kind of more satisfying, and the process of writing fiction more painful or kind of more embarrassing in some ways. And I was just wondering if you had to choose either essay writing or novel writing for the rest of your career, which would you choose?
I would choose novels, actually. Even though, there was a period when we were both writing a novel, and it was like a shame parade in our house. I was ashamed, you were ashamed. There's just so much shame every day. They're very connected to shame. It's an embarrassing form. It's a bit ridiculous. There's no reason for them. But an essay is just a way of being a smart-ass, and anyone can be a smart-ass. So for me, fiction is more intimate.
Where have we got to? Yeah, please.
Hi, I might be one of the few non-British in the audience, and I've read your books before, but I think I only really started feeling them when I moved to London. So my question really is, how do you feel you're perceived in other countries, and how does that reflect on you, or have you ever thought about, you described yourself earlier as a London living type of novel that you write?
Well, I think translation is weird, right? Trying to imagine what white teeth is in Polish or Korean. It's quite hard to get your mind around what the book means in that context. But I guess I don't always have a clear sense. I don't know. There's a language I know a bit better, Italian, so I have a bit more of a sense there. But I don't know is the answer. But you can't spend too much time considering it. I think if you thought of yourself as someone who had to have an effect in all these different territories, you go crazy. I just focus on the book I'm writing.
When I teach a course called London in Literature at UCL, and we have quite a lot of affiliate students from the States, and very often, quite sensibly, their approach to kind of text is to go to the
places.
So they'll do it with Daniel Defoe, but they do it with kind of your novels. So they'll go and kind of check out Archway Bridge or whatever it is.
My geography is very wonky. But do you remember Salman Rushdie saying that apparently the bus routes in Midnight's Children are all wrong, and he still gets letters from people in Mumbai complaining about the bus doesn't go there, you don't know what you're talking about. So there's a lot of that, yeah.
Please.
I was going to ask, as kind of semi-public figure, do you find it weird to often be asked...
Do
you find it weird to often be asked to reflect quite closely on your own creative process, and do you find it kind of odd to almost close analyse your own work?
That's yours.
No, go on.
Yeah, no, go on. Yeah, make you.
Yeah, it's awful. Yeah. It's awful talking about something. You always have kind of post hoc rationalizations of it, and even as you're saying it, you're thinking that's not true. So, and I think it kind of calcifies into a kind of stock response. But
it's also so different. Like there was a period a while ago when Nick was doing an anthology with Don Patterson, a Scottish poet, and I thought about the way that poets talk on stage or respond to questions, but when you hear two poets talking together, which I had to do a lot because they were discussing what poems were going to go in this anthology on Skype, two poets talking together is almost incomprehensible to an outsider. You know, it's like exchanges of lines very quickly, just half a poem, and then, oh, well, that's rubbish, and you don't know why. And they're just going back and forth. It's so different from the way poetry is presented to the outsider, which is kind of in nice prose and explained. It was like listening to a foreign language. And there is always that gap, I think, between practitioners talking to each other in a kind of shorthand and then this other thing of translation.
We've got time for about one more question. Okay, could we have, well, maybe two, one there and one there, and then we'll all go and have a drink.
Thank you. Thank you. Lovely to meet you both. I wondered whether you could take us through how you begin writing. So if there's something that you're thinking about writing, how do you go about that process, both as a kind of a poet and a prose writer?
It's completely different. You have to go first with poetry.
The poem comes. Berryman talks about it like a chime and odor. I usually get a kind of verbal frisson, a kind of like 2 or 3 words that seem to me just sort of interesting in some way, or have a kind of spark something, and then you kind of try and draw it out into a shape and a line, and then it kind of comes, and what you're sort of engaged with subconsciously kind of rises to the surface. Which makes it sound like a kind of steady process. It's not at all. It's a sort of a mess, and you'll keep going back to it. But it tends to begin with some kind of interesting phrase or interesting words, rather than like an image, which I think some poets do start with. But the fiction for me begins with an image usually, like something that has interest to me, and it's usually an image rather than verbal.
Yeah, it's the same. An image for the fiction, but then I notice a difference that in our house, poetry is on things, envelopes, it's on every, lines are written here and there, and you can see something growing or being circled around. Like I opened one of the kids' books yesterday, and there was a whole poem on the first page that you'd just written over the title page of this poor kid's book. But that kind of like stuff just happening all over, whereas with fiction, I think it's much more like, it's just much more in a straight line for me. It's work. I have a concept. I sit down. I make steady progress. It's much more in a straight line, and I have a vision of what I'm doing, and I just keep going in day after day. Whereas when you talk to poets, you never know.
But you've had books that came as like dreams, for example, on video.
Occasionally.
Yeah.
But then there's still the legwork, the boring
of course,
legwork. Yeah.
Sometimes you'll get a plot idea or something. Someone will tell you a story, and then you're like,
yes, anecdotes are good. Yeah.
You're bringing the curtain down, madam.
Oh, God.
Yes.
I've only got a simple book lover's question, but what have you been reading and enjoying lately? Because that's always good to hear.
I'm just fully immersed in this final Nausgard, I guess. But before that, we were both reading different books by a French writer called Emmanuel Carrère, who's just incredible, I think.
He's really good.
He's unbelievably good.
I'm reading his 1,000-page novel on the early Christian church.
Doesn't sound fun. He is amazing.
I have to say, it is terrific.
It's a masterpiece.
It sounds like it'll be so boring. It's so interesting.
And there's a book of his which I think is extraordinary.
Called The Adversary.
The Adversary, which is about a man. It's a famous, true story about a Belgian man who, for 30 years, had pretended to go to work every day. You probably know the story in the UN, I think. And then it was found out as a doctor, and in fact, all he was doing was sitting in his car and sometimes walking in the forest. And when he got discovered, he killed his parents, his children, his parents-in-laws, and his dog. And it's just the most extraordinary book. I mean, it sounds like some kind of salacious true crime, but it's actually about your sense of self and what happens when it's exploded, and it's unbelievable. But all his books are unbelievable, I think.
Okay, well, that's a bracing recommendation to go away with into the vernal glades of Queen's Park. Are you going to do a bit of signing?
Yeah. I think
so Zadie and Nick will do a bit of signing. Thanks for coming, and I'm sure you'd want me to say thanks for them.